Hello guys, Croft is here. When I saw Prometheus, I was quite surprised that the awakened engineer was so aggressive toward the human crew. Despite the fact that engineers created life on Earth, he immediately attempted to launch a ship designed to wipe out humanity. So I discovered completely new and controversial theories I never mentioned before that explain why engineers hate humans so much. And these theories tie directly to an explanation Ridley Scott revealed in a podcast about the engineers' hatred for humanity.
I need to know why. What did we do wrong? Why do you hate us?
Many people probably expected the engineers to be advanced and benevolent beings, but that's not what happened. The actual reason for their hatred towards us is directly connected to why they created humanity in the first place, and why they ultimately deemed it a failed experiment. Before delving into Scott's explanation and a particularly wild theory, I'll briefly mention some other compelling theories that might even sound more logical than the director's answer. One theory suggests that there are two factions of engineers: the creators who seeded life on Earth and the destroyers who believe that any life form other than themselves is unethical and should not exist. That would explain why the ship used by the creators at the beginning of Prometheus is different from the juggernauts used by the destroyers. It would also clarify why the engineers in the opening scene wear robes resembling religious outfits, while the engineers on LV-223 have biomechanical suits and worship a demon-like deity in the form of the Deacon. So just like humans, engineers may have different factions or ideologies, some wishing to spread life and others to eradicate it. Another theory states that engineers seed planets with life as a way to test the effectiveness of their bioweapons. And there's no better test than a live demolition of the entire planet using a newly developed bioweapon. Once a civilization reaches a certain level of technological advancement, the engineers would deploy their black goo to assess how effective it is. We know that engineers not only seeded Earth with life, but also created people on the planet 4. In the comics, it's also implied that they created other species like the tetrabrachial humanoids and the Wolframen, a special humanoid race intended to be a perfect benevolent life form. So the engineers may be experimenting with different humanoid designs to see which ones develop faster or prove more resilient to their bioweapons. However, another theory suggests that the engineer began killing people the moment he touched David. Perhaps the engineer realized David wasn't a biological creation and considered such artificial life disgusting. Or maybe the engineers believed that only they had the right to create life. Just like how humans later prohibited androids like Walter from becoming creators themselves. These are all pretty interesting theories, but let's talk about the pretty bizarre explanation Ridley Scott revealed on a podcast. As he directed Prometheus and is the mastermind behind the engineer's backstory, his insight is the official canon reason engineers hate humans. When Wayland wakes up the engineer and tries to speak to him, Shaw interrupts, prompting Wayland to order his men to hit her and threaten her with death if she speaks again.
If she opens her mouth, I can shoot her.
Although the film presents it as if the engineer doesn't understand English, it seems like he understood enough to see that humans are a violent and hierarchical species, where someone like Wayland is allowed to speak but not Elizabeth. And Ridley Scott's explanation ties directly into this. On the podcast, he said that he sees the engineers as gardeners of space, who occasionally visit dead planets and in their godlike generosity create life. However, they also periodically return to evaluate their creations, and if they find that their offsprings have lost their way, they wipe out the planet clean.
The term engineer, because in a funny kind of way they could be perceived as the gardeners of space. If the planet went wrong, they would want to wipe it clean. Look at these human beings that are jerks and they're killing the planet, killing themselves, can't settle down like a bunch of children. We should wipe it clean.
It is similar to the biblical God causing the Great Flood because the earth was filled with violence, corruption, and inequality. So the reason the engineers wanted to destroy humanity is because humans became extremely violent and had strayed away from their intended path. while the engineers themselves appear extremely hostile, which may seem like a contradiction, but it actually makes perfect sense according to the new radical theory I'm going to explain next. But when it comes to Ridley Scott's explanation, things get really crazy if we dig even deeper. In the film, it's mentioned that the outbreak on LV-223 occurred around 0 BC, which is also when the engineer went into cryosleep. This means that the deadly ship was originally meant to be launched around the time of Jesus Christ's crucifixion.
How long's it been dead?
2,000 years, give or take.
Ridley Scott implied that the engineers, seeing that humanity hadn't developed as planned, sent Jesus as their final attempt to guide humanity back onto the right path. In the first version of the Prometheus script titled Alien Engineers, it's explicitly mentioned that Jesus was their missionary. However, humanity ended up crucifying Jesus, which was the last straw. That prompted the engineers to conclude that life on Earth was a failure, and they began preparing to launch a deadly ship. The awakened engineer, seeing Weyland's aggressive behavior toward Shaw, realizes that humans are not only even more violent and corrupt, but have also developed interstellar travel, making them an even greater threat to other engineer creations. So because of our violent aspect, engineers considered humanity a failed experiment, deemed to be destroyed. And that brings us to the new controversial theory that I've never mentioned before, as many people thought that it was kind of hypocritical that engineers hated humans because of our violent nature, even though engineers themselves are extremely violent. The engineers' actual goal was to create a species that would be a purified version of themselves, completely cleansed from violence that plagued the engineers' civilization. The official documentary about making Prometheus reveals the alien master narrative, an early blueprint about the history of engineers. The blueprint says that engineers installed research facilities on LV-426 to study the problem of humanity, which we know is violence. Maybe the engineers' primary goal was to create a life form that would be non-violent and peaceful. It seems that the engineers recognized that they themselves were violent and tried to isolate the violent gene from the gene pool, so that life forms they propagate using their own physiology would not be violent but peaceful. The engineers considered humanity a failed experiment and wanted to reset the slate after realizing that humans inherited engineers' own violent tendencies. And the crucifixion of Jesus was the breaking point, proving that humans would kill the kindest and the most good-hearted individual. In other words, engineers tried to expunge violence from their own genetic line. Having lost the ability to reproduce naturally, they might have attempted to engineer a peaceful successor race free of aggression. However, isolating this violent gene led to the black goo, which is basically the concentration of violent genetic material, which explains why the black goo is so dangerous and mutagenic. It could be that after the engineers lost their ability to reproduce, they wanted to ensure that future generations do not inherit any violent qualities, which is also a problem humans face today, considering constant wars throughout history. It appears that the violent gene keeps persisting, creating perpetual conflicts. No matter how advanced we become, the violent gene prevails, fueling wars with increasingly sophisticated weapons and pushing us closer to extinction. It's almost as if the evolution isn't fast enough, unable to erase humanity's violent tendencies to match our rapid technological progress. So even for humans, it wouldn't be such a bad idea to ensure that anyone sent to Mars has those violent genes edited out, creating a new Mars civilization built on peace from the very start. So for the engineers, it could be that through their experiments they tried to create a life form that would be non-violent, but they failed. Instead of peace, they birthed the black goo, a distilled essence of violence and hyper-evolution. Xenomorphs as a result can be seen as the living embodiment of that pure aggression. However, there is another controversial theory that completely flips the entire narrative on its head. According to this radical interpretation, we've completely misunderstood engineers' intentions. The engineers didn't actually hate humanity, but were attempting to upgrade it. Humanity was never the end goal, and we were created to serve as perfect hosts for the engineer gods, the xenomorphs. Although the black goo killed the beings on Planet 4, mummifying them on contact, its interaction with humans such as Shaw and Fifield resulted in xenomorph-like mutations. So according to this radical theory, the engineers were making humanity a favor by transforming us into their gods, the deacons, just as depicted on the mural. So let's examine the evidence supporting this theory, and there's quite a lot of it. The massive engineer's stone head in the temple has its surface marked by lines and dots that suggest mutation from the black goo. This isn't merely a monument, but it's a shrine to transformation itself, as if the process of mutation is sacred. Behind it, there's a mural depicting the first deacon, an ancient xenomorph deity, suggesting that the engineers didn't see the xenomorph as a monster, they see it as a divine being. In addition, the film's opening scene shows an engineer performing a ritualistic act of self-sacrifice. Clothed in religious robes, he drinks the black goo and disintegrates, seeding Earth with life. On the surface, it seems like a mythical act of creation, but when viewed in the context of the urn chamber, it takes on a whole new meaning. The engineer is planting a species, humans, designed to reach a point where they can serve as perfect hosts for the deacons. So the black goo is not an accident, but a sacred medium, a bridge between the engineers and the life forms they worship, which hints at another crucial piece of evidence. Initially in the temple, instead of the green crystal, there was supposed to be the urn, the exact same one as in the beginning of Prometheus, suggesting that the substance in the beginning could have actually been the exact black goo as in the temple. If engineers worship the xenomorphs, then why do they run from them in fear in the temple? Human history is filled with examples of reverence born from terror, like the worship of furious gods, lightnings, and dictators. Fear is often the foundation of devotion, so the engineer's awe toward the xenomorph stems from its lethal perfection. A terrible beauty that the black goo summons, not by corrupting life, but by elevating it into something closer to their divine ideal, the deacon. So unleashing the black goo on Earth looks like a genocide for us, but to the engineers it's a harvest. From our perspective, they wanted to destroy us, but from theirs we were a vessel, an incubator meant to give rise to something greater. So in essence, they weren't erasing us out of hatred, but were completing a cycle, as we weren't made for companionship, creativity, or curiosity. We were made to serve a specific purpose, hosts for their perfect life form. This theme echoes in David's conversation with Holloway. When asked why humans created him, Holloway responds, "Because we could."
We made you because we could.
So David, just like us, was built with a purpose to serve and to obey. And just like us, David seeks to be something more and doesn't want to be a disposable tool. In the same way, humans do not want to be hosts for the engineered deities. In overall, Ridley Scott's inspiration for the engineers' hatred of humans stemmed from the constant wars throughout human history. Our violent nature, he believes, is what made the engineers abandon and eventually try to eliminate humanity. Scott expressed his disgust with human conflict and violence on the podcast all the way in 2017, but with ongoing military crises today, his message feels even more relevant. Thank you guys for watching. What do you think about these theories and Ridley Scott's explanation? And why do you think engineers ultimately hate us, and do they actually hate us at all? Leave your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to join the Patreon for extra support. Also, like this video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel for more content. My name is Croft and I'll see you in the next video.